All right. Okay. Well, we're ready to get things started tonight. Our event tonight is on Thai-U.S. relations, the elephant and the eagle. My name is George McLeod. I'm the moderator for this evening. Thailand's status as a key non-NATO ally of the United States has endured since the Cold War, with close trade relations and defense cooperation, including the annual Cobra Gold joint military exercises. Relations have been tested recently since the 2014 coup that triggered censure by the world's most powerful country. In January, Assistant U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Russell criticized the kingdom's political situation at Chulalongkorn University. That caused the relations with China to warm quite rapidly between Thailand and the U.S. and China. With a new U.S. ambassador on the horizon, where do things stand in this roller coaster relationship, and what can we expect next? The FCCT is pleased to welcome the following speakers for our event tonight. Kasit Piromya is a career diplomat who served as foreign minister in the government of Prime Minister Abhisit between 2008 and 2011. He previously served as ambassador to the US, Russia, Indonesia, Germany, and Japan. He was a member of the People's Alliance for Democracy and recently has been in the news for joining the People's Democratic Reform Foundation. Next is David Lyman, who's an icon of Thailand's American business community, having served as president of the American Chamber of Commerce. He is chief values officer at Tilaka & Gibbons law firm, a role that extends beyond legal matters to creating an ethical business environment. He's a former submarine officer in the U.S. Navy and has been active with the World Economic Forum in Davos for 18 years. He's a member of the Board of Governors at the University of California, Hastings College of Law. And we have Benjamin Zawacki, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was recently a visiting fellow at Harvard Law. He's based in Bangkok, was previously Amnesty International researcher and advisor at the International Commission of Jurists. He is currently completing a book on Thailand's relationship with the US, which I believe will be released next year. So we'll start with Kun Kasit, please.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and for the interest in the Thai-US relations. I think the Thai-US relations, the very nature or the characteristic of it is that it's quite comprehensive in nature, covering many fields, namely security affairs, cultural, people to people, education, civil society, administrative governance, legal and judicial improvement, trade and economic activities, regional multilateral cooperation, humanitarian and disaster management and rehabilitation, technical and financial cooperative activities, institutional buildings, human resource development and capacity building, the sharing of experiences and good or best practices, as well as political cooperation, the common vision, and the sharing of democratic aspirations. So the task of the two treaty-allied countries, on one side Thailand, the designated non-NATO allied, are to ensure development and progress of this quite comprehensive relationship, to make sure that it is progressive, constructive. And such bilateral relations continue against the backdrop of almost 2 centuries of friendship, successful cooperation in the repulse of the domino theory, and eventually the defeat of communism. And now, presently, the two countries are working together to fight global security issues of terrorism, extremism, and cross-border crimes. But relations, like any other human activities, have their ups and downs. Some aspect of the overall relationship make tangible and positive advances. Some have hiccups and drawbacks. The case in hand is the struggling of the common political democratic aspiration unpracticed. The democratization process of Thailand for the past 83 years and parliamentary and ex-parliamentary turmoils have been witnessed by friends from near and afar. Parliamentary representative democracy of Thailand has not yet reached the level of expected sophistication and maturity. It has been having its drawbacks and weaknesses and discrepancies. The rational gamuts and fabrics of democracy are still being eroded and subverted by traditional old practices of patron-client relationship, of familial and parochial relationship, of money politics, of personality cult adoration, and simply of greed and craving, of denial of access to information, and of expansive participatory politics. If any aspect of the Thai-US holistic relationship is a step back, is retarded, is obstructive, and delayed, then it must be redressed in a cooperative and understanding manner. That is what friends with deep, long friendship should do to one another. So it is not a question of crime and punishment. It is not the question of wrongdoing must be reprimanded and finger pointed at. Various happenings have led to the democratic instability that eventually led to the military coup d'etat and military takeover of government in Thailand. Concerned and genuine care of a true friend would then ask, what were the causes of the instability and the turmoil? Why has such come to pass? And then what can I, the United States, or we, the United States, do for Thailand as friend and allied? In order to overcome the democratic deficiencies, and Thailand cannot do it alone, it needs friends. It needs the experiences and the advice and the know-how of democratic friends around the world, particularly the United States, in order to acquire a sustainable and mature democracy after 83 years. But what did we see, or what we have been seeing instead? It's not the offer or the gesture of friendship and cooperative action, but negative expressions of concern, of disappointment, of dislike, of displeasure. Then that displeasure leads to demand that democracy must be quickly restored. And displeasure is followed by soft sanctions of the lowering of diplomatic relationship, of the suspension of other aspects or activities of the comprehensive relationship. One particular deficiency of the democratic polity then affects the other aspect of the overall relationship. Is it right? Is it appropriate? Is it called for? Is it really justifiable? The military government is working on peace, stability, development, and particularly the reform of Thailand to move it back toward democracy. Now is therefore the time for the United States and friends around the world to render hands assistance for the curing of the deficiencies of Thai democratic polity. We need the know-how and the best practices. So what the United States need to do is to have the heart to understand and appreciate the difficulties and the deficiency, and ask what the United States can do for Thailand so that Thailand can help itself to build a strong, viable, and sustainable democratic entity. In the meantime, let the US administration, the Thai military junta, sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk about the causes of failures of democracies, of the possible way outs, and the timetable to return to democracy, of the elements and contents of the reform process. From the point of view and intention of the military leaders, and the possible positive and contributive role of the United States as friends. That's what friendship is all about. That's what friends do to one another. And just do away with this finger pointing, and let's move the relationship forward, because the aspiration of the Thai people has never subsided in trying to regain democracy and to make democracy a workable formula for Thai political life. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. David Lyman, please.
I think you read my speech. Before I get started, I've been asked by the management to refresh everyone's mind and memory, rather, that the book Americans in Thailand is available here for anyone who is quite interested, and we hope everyone will be interested. For those of you who have not seen the book, my picture is on the cover, and if you can find it, you get a donut. Anyway, so do take a look. They are available here at the office of the Foreign Correspondents Club. People remind me that I'm rather long of tooth, and because I am a lot older than I look. And someone who's, I won't mention his name, sent me just yesterday a word of encouragement, and it reads as follows. It says, sex at 82. I just took a leaflet out of my letterbox informing me that I can have sex at 82. I'm not 82. And I'm so very happy because I live at 74. So it's not so far to walk home afterwards. All right. All right, now to something a little bit more serious. I've entitled my remarks, "It's Easy to Criticize." And so stop moaning and groaning and get on with fixing the problems. The hard part is to get the fix right. Tonight's discussion is occasioned by the ongoing public display of and reactions to the U.S. criticism of the current Thai government's handling of its governance structure, its policies, its actions and non-actions, and particularly what the U.S., in its opinion, views as its origin and shortcomings. These are counterbalanced by the reactions of Thai officialdom and some of the local population. This brouhaha has been extensively covered by the local and international press and Thai's ever-expanding social media users and audience. So, except for my one comment coming up, it serves little purpose for me to repeat what we all know, or think we know, about the facts, and more importantly, about the assumptions related to these occurrences. Historically, the United States is not thrilled by military coups, particularly those which it does not orchestrate. I'm bound to piss off everybody tonight at some point. They are an anathema to U.S. foreign policy, dictum of love-only democracies. Why coups occur is of minor importance. As to the May 22, 2014 Thailand coup, my personal and probably controversial view is that as a long-term resident in amazing Thailand, is that the Thai military did the right thing. Short of an outbreak of civil war then brewing, there was an economic standstill and a dearth of other viable options to untangle the Gordian knot of the Thai political turmoil. Let's not rehash the negatives of the U.S. lambast directed at Thailand and the Thai reaction of resentment at being lectured by the United States, coupled with the Thai loss of face precipitating the so-called usual Thai denial of responsibility and blame somebody else responses, while the authorities appoint another committee to investigate. Instead, I would like to bring to the forefront the positive ongoing achievements and contributions by both the Thai and the Americans to promote, repair, and cement the long-standing relationship between the U.S. and Thailand. Given the evidence that I'm aware of, it is flourishing. That age-old world alliance and partnership does not falter or fall apart just because of periodically publicly announced criticism. In terms of the passage of time, what is happening is now just a hiccup. We think alike, sir. His Excellency the Thai Prime Minister knows this and has reacted accordingly. In this respect, he has been level-headed and stabilizing. While I disagree with a number of the actions of both Thailand and the United States emanating from the coup of 2014 and its aftermath, by the way, this is my 13th coup which I have experienced in my sojourn in this country. And accepting that the Thai economy is lacking, I am supporting the continuing efforts by both sides to build the ideal Thailand world we all hope will arrive. My advice to all is, don't be derailed by the occasional outbursts of critical rhetoric, even if it's not in the wisest form of discreet diplomacy. Neither country in this arena is perfect or without its own share of mishaps, faults, and failures. Both parties in any relationship have to do what needs to be done to achieve legitimate objectives, to revitalize and to reinforce that relationship. They have to get on with it. And despite opinions to the contrary, that seems to me to be what is happening between Thailand and the United States today. Give Thailand the time and the slack it needs to change for the better, as is the stated policy of this government, to undo the many decades of accumulated abuses, defects, corruption, money politics, and neglect by an endless line of previously democratically elected governments, politicians, civil servants, the business community, and the Thai military and the Thai police. Get real. Substantive instant solutions do not exist. The end result goal that we cannot achieve, the end result goal cannot be achieved overnight, or even in a few months, or perhaps years. Perfection requires patience to get it right. Thai-style democracy, or the perceived abatement thereof, appears to be at the heart of this discourse. Yes, there have been and will be mistakes, backsliding, misdirections, oversights, excesses, and failures along the path of learning the most effective ways to prevail and reach this target, consistent with local and international expectations. Bear in mind what history has taught us, that governments too often do not act or pursue policies which are in their own best interests. That's a quote from Barbara Tuchman, a very famous American historian, in her book, The March of Folly. Since first proposed by President Woodrow Wilson back during World War I, that's 100 years ago, the U.S. has espoused the foreign policy of, quote, saving the world for democracy, unquote. This fundamental policy took hold in the 1930s and guided the United States through stopping the spread of Nazism and fascism in the West and Japan's militarism in the East before and during World War II. The Truman Doctrine of 1946, the Marshall Plan, Churchill's Iron Curtain counter policies set the course of the Cold War for 5 decades, inclusive of the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. In its simplest synopsis of being democracy and capitalism versus communism. These were wars of ideology for the hearts and minds of people and nations, as well as wars of economics. Today, a new war of crimes against humanity has emerged and grown against the spread of fundamentalist Islam, its onerous attempts to impose their ideology on others. As said earlier, in its endeavors to spread democracy around the world, the U.S. has not always been right in all that it says or does, far from it. Hypocrisy and duplicity and just plain ignorance have not been lacking in the U.S. and in its government leaders. But let's not get bogged down on analyzing historical misadventures. For the past 83 years, Thailand has struggled valiantly to find the best form and type of democracy that will suit its needs and aspirations for the country and its people. They're still working on it. The classic democracy form of government, as defined by the ancient Greeks and Romans, that is, ruled by an unfettered majority, did not and does not work. I can elaborate on this more during the Q&A if you would like. What has worked, to one degree or another, is constitutional democracy. This is where a constitution reigns as the supreme law of the land and the rights of the minority are protected. The classic example of this is the United States, which is actually a republic, not a democracy. The word democracy does not appear in the U.S. Declaration of Independence or in its Constitution or in the Constitution of any of the states of the United States. It's a republic. Some of the key elements of a constitutional monarchy, almost synonymous with a republic, are a comprehensive constitution, an open legal framework, stable political systems, adherence to the rule of law, freedom of expression, limits on the powers of what governments and their leaders can do and cannot do, checks and balances on the actions of the basic branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, to prevent abuses by any of them and abuses by the people who run them, and also requires an informed and responsible electorate, both those in power and those in the opposition, to keep each other honest, and elections by the whole population of responsible and accountable representatives. That's the ideal. Former Thai Prime Minister Anand Paniyotchun defined it as in his 7 pillars of sustainable democracy: elections, political tolerance, the rule of law, freedom of expression, accountability and transparency, decentralization, and civil society. Political activism is a necessary component as well. The 18 previous constitutions have failed to achieve their desired results. Hence the concerted effort of current minds to formulate that elusive perfect solution to be embodied in the next upcoming constitution, which is supposed to be presented to the public sometime next month. As to why they have not worked in the past, basically the then existing Thai constitutional democracy system of checks and balances failed repeatedly, as the popular elected majority in power abused and misused their powers for personal gain. There are 2 rival theories of constitutional democracy. One is founded in England by John Locke, with which we are familiar, and the other was founded in France by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a country where in the 1920s and 1930s, Thailand's Pibul Songkhram and Kunpriti were schooled. These men were the leaders of the Thailand's 1932 revolution, which transformed the then existing absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. The 2 approaches, the British and the French, to constitutional government conflict in their definitions of governing. The then Thai leaders adopted the French system of constitutional democracy, following, in effect, Napoleon's empire rules. Let's get back to my main strategy: supporting activities to strengthen Thai-U.S. relationships. Most, if not all, of the civilians in the current Thai cabinet are U.S. educated, as are some of the military ministers. They understand where America is coming from and support the principles which built that nation. They understand the cultural differences, yet maintain their Thai-ness and Thai values. The U.S. mission in Thailand is perhaps the 2nd largest in the world. There are over 70 U.S. government agencies represented here, many with regional as well as Thai responsibilities. As I recall, there are probably 4,000 plus or minus U.S. and Thai staff based here, including their families. Many of these agencies and people work quietly behind the scenes to help Thailand achieve its greatness in the world of nations. For instance, extensive and broad training and cooperation of the Thai police and justice officials on catching bad guys is ongoing and all-encompassing. American government health and agencies like AFRIMS and the CDC work with Thai researchers and medical personnel in helping Thailand to develop a vaccine to prevent malaria and dengue fevers, and they deal with other tropical disease needs. A number of these agencies are working to help Thailand with its environmental challenges, such as working to stop the poaching of wildlife, the destruction of forest reserves, and stopping of criminal trafficking of wild flora and fauna. Next to smuggling of drugs, guns, and people, such illicit activity is the next largest money generator on this planet of organized crime. Just recently, Thailand opened up its Utapao air base and Sati military ports for the U.S. and Thailand to provide humanitarian relief and assistance to the earthquake victims of Nepal, helping to save countless lives. The Peace Corps continues to receive support from both countries, as does the work of the Asia Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Keenan Institute, among others. The Thai-U.S. Creative Partnership, promoting innovative ideas and creating technology, research, and practices across a wide range of disciplines, is flourishing. Thousands of Thai students are helped here with their educational needs and advice on educational opportunities in the American educational institutions. The Fulbright and American Field Service Scholarship programs continue. America returns to Thailand hundreds of Thai antiques in searching for their homeland. Cultural exchanges continue unabated. The U.S. provides financial support for the restoration of Thai religious and ethnic historical heritage sites. It has just supported the Thai teams to the 2015 Special Olympics. And despite the speculations to the contrary, multilateral security cooperation and Cobra Gold are still up and running. The American private sector businesses have long represented a substantial portion of foreign investment in Thailand, and more are coming here to Thailand, being welcomed here. Concurrently, Thai businesses are now investing in the United States. No relationship tensions here that I'm aware of. On the Thai side, consistent with its reform programs over the past year, the government has shepherded through a raft of needed legislation addressing many issues of national significance. To date, about 110 new laws and amendments to existing laws have been adopted since June of last year. 83 have been published in the Government Gazette, and 27 are still awaiting publication. They deal with the economy, agriculture, human trafficking and exploitation, corruption, energy and the environment, communications, budgeting and taxation, education, corruption as I mentioned earlier, domestic and wildlife animals welfare, fishing, migrants, immigration, transportation, water management, regional cooperation such as the AEC and ASEAN, for example, plus addressing other problems plaguing the Thai society. The next and very critical step, of course, is to monitor the implementation and enforcement of these and pre-existing laws. Many more laws in the pipeline are in various stages of development. Some have risen to the top because of both local civil society and international pressures. There's an old saying, which holds true for many communities, that it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And Thais do hear and respond to threats to their international image and reputation. The U.S. does not respond to such threats. I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap up my remarks. Having lived in Thailand professionally for the past 48 years, plus a few more starting in 1949, some 66 years ago, when my parents moved to what my father called Old Siam, I've witnessed a number of ups and downs in the U.S.-Thai love affair. Yes, over the years, there have been squabbles, bruised egos, and some caustic differences. But the fundamental underlying mutual respect and trust between these two nations has never waned or been seriously threatened or been placed in jeopardy of no return. Look at the fundamentals. While they differ on some of the details, both countries want what they perceive is best for Thailand and its people. The U.S., by its unappreciated and perhaps overbearing condemnations, is not acting out of spite or malice. Some of its actions are dictated by U.S. domestic law. American foreign policy is obsessed with the concept of elections, though in my view, not so much with what happens after the elections. The U.S. long-standing guiding policy is what's good for America is good for Thailand and good for the rest of the world too. A little naive and arrogant, perhaps, and to some extent impractical. And while perhaps not sensitive enough to non-American cultural values and differences, the hearts of the vocal American officials and those well-meaning Thai official counterparts are in the right place. So let's calm frayed nerves, assuage quick tempers, ask the players to keep their mouths zipped tightly shut, and get on with the stated objective of supporting Thailand in its quest for the sorely needed reforms to its systems, its infrastructure, its political societies, and in overcoming the barriers to attaining those goals through a Thai-originated solution. That will be the win-win scenario. Thank you.
Thank you. And Benjamin, please.
Thank you, and good evening. It's definitely an honor to be on the panel with, I won't say elder statesmen, but I'll say seasoned statesmen to my left, both of whom were kind enough to be interviewed for the book that I'm writing, and for which I'm appreciative. I do recognize that this is neither a book launch nor a book talk, although after 2 years of research, I do rather wish that it were. But I will begin with a brief word about my book, if I might, because I think it will serve to qualify some of the remarks that come thereafter. The book is called Continental Drift, Thailand at the Turn of a Sino-American Century. And in contrast, in fact, to what George said, it actually covers two relationships, two bilateral relationships, the U.S.-Thailand relationship and also the Thailand-China relationship. Further, it goes as far back, actually, as World War II and through the coup d'etat of last year, of 2014. I have no intent of dragging the audience through a second relationship this evening or through 70 years of history, although I am not above that. But I do mention that because I don't believe that the current state of U.S.-Thai relations in 2015 can be fully appreciated without an understanding of China's role in the region and without an understanding of the past 7 decades of history among and between the three countries. Indeed, my book, I think, and hope at least rather uniquely, not only looks at both of Thailand's bilateral relationships, Thai-US, Thai-China, but looks at them in relationship to one another, not as separate, independent parallel tracks, but rather in their constant intersection. So I mention this because the China angle very much informs a lot of the conclusions that I will try to limit myself to the U.S.-Thailand relationship tonight. But by way of sort of transparency and full disclosure, even where I don't make China explicit, I need you to understand that much of what I'm saying about the U.S. and Thailand, China is very much implicit in my reaching some of those conclusions. As the title suggests, Continental Drift, I believe that Thailand is undergoing a calibrated, qualified shift in both the direction and the orientation of its foreign policy. By direction, I mean the direction in which it's going, and orientation meaning to where it is looking. I believe this shift is moving away from the United States and eastward toward the People's Republic of China. To borrow a Cold War term that I think is still very relevant, spheres of influence are at play, whereby after a half century of being within the US sphere of influence, to varying degrees of course, Thailand is moving into that of the Chinese. A couple of qualifying remarks attend this conclusion as well. First of all, when I mention shift, or rather, when I mention drift, continental drift, I'm speaking strictly of the United States. If I were talking about Thailand or China, the relevant word, the operative word would be shift. Okay, when I talk about drift, I'm talking about a policy drift on the part of the United States whereby it has moved itself away from Thailand, even as Thailand itself has calibratedly, qualifiedly, and purposely shifted away from the United States and toward China. I am not suggesting that China is about to replace the United States. Okay, that is neither possible nor desirable for either of the two countries, the US or Thailand in this situation. The United States 7th Fleet is here to stay. It still basically runs the South China Sea like a lake. It still views the better part of the Pacific as a lake, and it's not going anywhere. So I don't want to overstate my case such that you misunderstand me as saying that China is about to replace the United States. Secondly, with or without the Americans, and regardless of the degree to which Thailand moves into the sphere of influence of the Chinese, I am not suggesting that Thailand is about to become a client state of China. During the mid-60s, when Thailand hosted the second largest foreign deployment of American troops and materiel in Thailand, that may have constituted a client state or something close to it. Thailand's foreign policy was almost entirely dictated by the United States. Thailand held 700 airplanes, 48,000 American troops at its peak, and during 1965, the US government was Thailand's second largest employer to that of the Thai government. We could quibble as to whether that constituted a client state in the mid-1960s. What I want there to be no misunderstanding about is that Thailand is not in danger or in desire of becoming a client state of the Chinese. And third, as Kun Kasit mentioned early on, and David as well, when you talk about these two bilateral relationships, there's a danger to speak of them in monolithic terms, which of course is entirely inaccurate. These relationships need to be disaggregated into their economic terms, political, diplomatic, military, etc. And yet, when I talk about this calibrated shift away from the Americans and toward the Chinese, I do believe it cuts across these disaggregated elements of the two bilateral relationships. The military-to-military aspect is the aspect for which what I'm saying is the least true, at least in the short term. Moving mill-to-mill relations away from the Americans and toward the Chinese is a bit like moving an aircraft carrier. You start slow, and you really only begin to appreciate the shift until after some time, but I do believe it is underway as well. The shift or drift in the case of the Americans, however, I do think is beyond the point of slowing down, arresting, much less reversing in the short or even medium terms. I think we're looking at several decades whereby the country, again, continues to move and to look eastward in its foreign policy. What I need to do is not drag you through 70 years of history, but I'm actually going to tonight focus on 1997 through about the coup d'etat of 2006. I am aware that the title of tonight's talk is Thai-Chinese relations today, or I'm sorry, Thai-American relations today. But I think the argument I'm making, first of all, requires that I go back as far as 1997. I think the shift/drift of what I'm saying began in 1997. And I firmly believe that the argument I make only becomes stronger after the coup of 2006. In fact, I began writing this book, or at least writing the introduction to this book, in 2013, a full year before the 2014 coup, when I believed that the case for the book was strong. Then I think it's only stronger in the wake of the 2014 coup. So the seeds, I think, for this drift and shift were planted in 1997 with the financial crisis that took place here. It brought Thailand to its knees, and shortly thereafter the rest of the region. As has been well documented by others, the American response was a number of things, none of them positive. The response that they dictated through the IMF and eventually through bilateral assistance was, first of all, economically inappropriate to the problem at hand. It probably had the effect, in the short term at least, of exacerbating the crisis as opposed to relieving Thailand of its economic woes, and the crisis indeed spread in the short term thereafter. Perhaps more importantly in terms of lasting wounds is that the American approach in 97 was extremely arrogant and extremely dogmatic, both through the IMF and independently so. If my 74 interviews now that I've conducted for this book are any indication, at least on the Thai side of the equation, then some of those wounds from 1997 frankly have not entirely healed, or at least some of the criticism in the past year and a half has served to sort of reopen some of those wounds. The number of references that have been made by Thai foreign policy practitioners in particular to 97 has been really quite staggering. U.S. assistance didn't actually come until 1998. It was a full 10 months after the crisis broke out, and by that time much of the damage had been done or in fact repaired. And perhaps most lastingly and perhaps most remembered by Thais is the fact that the Americans took advantage, frankly, economically speaking, of the situation to advance some of their market interests in Thailand, such that while Thai companies struggled to sort of come up from out of that morass that they found themselves in, American investment and American companies actually did quite well, broadly speaking. I mean, I don't want to get into specifics at the moment, but certainly broadly speaking at the time, in such a way that it seemed to be, and indeed was, advantage taking on the part of the United States. And finally, as an aside, and I'll do this throughout my remarks where I think it's relevant, just to note that China was the first country actually to offer assistance in the wake of the financial crisis. They offered $1 billion. One shouldn't overstate the importance of that. First of all, $1 billion in relation to the $17.4 billion that Thailand was seeking was not a very tidy sum of money, number one. Number two, it was just a pledge. It was never actually given. But given that the US didn't even participate in the initial IMF bailout package, the kind of political capital reaped by China at the time, and certainly in retrospect, by offering that $1 billion and offering it first, is something that, again, Thai policymakers keep mentioning as late as 2015 as I interview them for this book. It was what I call a bit of a seed that the Chinese were planting, taking advantage of the opportunity to show themselves as being slightly different from the Americans, and for that matter from the Japanese, in the response to the crisis. I had a long interview with former US Ambassador Skip Boyce for this book, who was the deputy ambassador to Thailand at the time of the crisis. And he argues, I think rightly, that in the wake of the crisis, in the long wake of the crisis, certainly when Chuan Likpai came back into power, the US, quote unquote, crawled 2/3 of the way back. That's true. I spoke to Kun Chuan recently, who couldn't talk enough, and he's not the only one, about the buying back by the United States of F-18 fighters that Thailand had in fact already purchased. They were in the pipeline, they were being constructed, the down payment had been given, and rather uniquely, the United States decided to buy those planes from the private contractor that was constructing them. It waived the fine, and in fact went so far as to return the down payment in kind so that Thailand could later buy used F-16 fighters a number of years later. Kun Chuan, in fact, used an expression that loosely translates into English as being, if you give an inch, we'll take a mile. Where on a state visit to the United States, he met with Secretary of Defense Cohen and essentially said, look, you've been generous enough, and I'm going to ask for a bit more. We really need the deposit back as well. And again, that was returned to Thailand in kind. I described Kun Chuan, incidentally, in my book as the last pro-American prime minister. And I do that because one of the reasons the relations were repaired as soundly as they were under his second administration was because of his leadership and his desire to see those relations repaired. Not only were the Americans, quote unquote, crawling back, but the Thais were looking to re-solidify things as well. I do need to mention, though, as again I have a tendency to do, that during the last 2 years of the Chuan administration, there were 1,500 exchanges between Thailand and the Chinese at all levels. It was the largest number of exchanges, diplomatic and other exchanges, that Thailand had with any other country in the world. Also in the year 2000, the Sino-Thai Action Plan for the 21st Century was signed between the two countries, an action plan that never really got off the ground vis-a-vis the Americans in the following decade, despite some efforts. The book, as I mentioned, is called Continental Drift, which is a geological term, right, suggesting or meaning the movement of tectonic plates below the Earth's surface, typically in a very slow manner that most of us don't appreciate because it's happening so slowly and so deeply below the ground. But occasionally those tectonic plates move quickly enough or abruptly enough to cause an earthquake. The closest thing to an earthquake in, I think, US-Thai relations occurred in 2001 on account of two seminal events in either country, neither of which may have necessarily affected the relationship, but both of which eventually affected the relationship to a large degree. In Thailand, of course, that was the landslide election of Thaksin Shinawatra, who came to power and came to office in January 2001. And in the United States, 8-9 months later, were the terrorist attacks in Washington and New York, known as 9/11 on September 11th, 2001. Thaksin's foreign policy was deeply affected and negatively affected by the attacks of 9/11 and by subsequent US foreign policy. I must say, however, that while I'm extremely critical of Thaksin's human rights record, as a former Amnesty International researcher I would be, the human rights record under his 5-year tenure was easily the worst this country has seen since the US-backed dictatorship of Field Marshal Sarit between 1957 and 1963. And he certainly has a case to answer, possibly in some sort of international tribunal, for the crimes that were perpetrated on his watch. Having said that, his foreign policy was frankly relatively visionary, and it was one which, to the extent it was negative at all, was largely negative on account of the Americans. And to the extent that it was benign, or would have been benign, was simply on account of a prudent choice on his part and that of his foreign minister to direct the country slightly eastward, to emphasize regional countries, to place particular emphasis on China. And I think the proof of the worthiness of Thaksin's foreign policy is the fact that many of his initiatives were carried on by subsequent governments. Some of them, admittedly, were Thaksin nominees, but others of which were not. I think, for example, of the Chiang Mai Initiative that was developed in the wake of the financial crisis. ECMEX, ECMES, on the Mekong. The appointment of a trade czar to be essentially Bob Zoellick's counterpart on the American side during trade negotiations. And certainly his Asia Cooperation Dialogue. These 4 initiatives, among others, have been, to a greater or lesser degree, carried on by subsequent governments and are, again, to a greater or lesser degree, alive and well today. It's also worth noting that Thaksin won this landslide election largely on, we'll say, anti-IMF sentiment. And he was too smart a politician to mention the United States directly. But he was basically able to capitalize on a very pro-US Chuan government that preceded him, capitalize on the sort of sentiment that you're feeling in Thailand today vis-a-vis the Americans, and was able to parlay that sentiment into a government. However, as I mentioned, US foreign policy in the wake of 9/11, I think, helped turn what would have otherwise been a neutral or even benign foreign policy that Thaksin had, which was one that would simply emphasize Asia, but not necessarily to the exclusion of the Americans. Again, I don't believe that Thaksin or anyone else is looking to sideline the Americans. But the US approach was such that the effect of it was that Thaksin was left with little choice but to reach out even more to the Chinese than he might have otherwise been inclined to do, primarily on account of an extremely myopic approach to foreign policy conducted by the Americans at the time, by which I'm referring, of course, to the global war on terror. Thaksin, somewhat to his credit, I think, initially resisted participating as much as he could in that conflict. Now, his excuse at the time, among others, was that Thailand has a sizable Muslim community. It's a bit disingenuous considering he ended up alienating and exacerbating the Muslim problem in the Deep South in subsequent years. But nonetheless, he looked to hold the ground against this aggressive American policy, but eventually had to capitulate. And some of the anecdotes I've gotten from the principals at the time are really, they add spice to the book in terms of some of these close calls whereby the Americans and Thaksin were really at loose ends as to how to make this work. Eventually, Thaksin did resist becoming a party of the coalition of the willing in U.S. military adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, and compromised by contributing troops on a humanitarian reconstructive basis as those conflicts, at least as the beginning of those conflicts, wound down. Thaksin signed a bilateral status of forces agreement with the United States that would shield U.S. military personnel from ICC, International Criminal Court jurisdiction in Thailand. It was a quick win for the Americans, and it really didn't gain Thailand much, except, again, I would argue implicitly than to look further east for further guidance amidst this war on terror. Most of what he had to deal with was terrorism related. I spoke very recently to his foreign minister, who, and I'm quoting, said to me, look, my first year was 9/11. My second year was Afghanistan. My third year was Iraq. My fourth year was more Iraq. And by the time that was all finished, what room was there for economics? What room was there for other issues? And where were the Chinese? Now, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but that's more or less the quotation I was given. It's not that the Americans lacked the initiative, at least here in Bangkok, to put forth other ideas. The free trade agreement, for example, is something that keeps coming up. If you look at the WikiLeaks cables, and I took advantage of Boston's superlatively negative winter this year to read 3,331 WikiLeaks cables, and the free trade agreement comes up very often. The trouble was there was very little backing for that agreement in Washington, or at least to the extent there was backing, it continually got subsumed or sidelined by war on terror initiatives. And so a free trade agreement was never actually signed between the United States and Thailand. It doesn't exist today. And yet the same month it was mooted between Bush and Thaksin was the very same month in which China and Thailand did sign a free trade agreement. And so again, you have a sort of zero-sum dynamic at work at times vis-a-vis these two bilateral relationships, and it sometimes comes very much to the fore, as in the case of the free trade agreement. And what did Thailand get in return for this? It got major non-NATO status, which almost invariably among both the American and the Thai policymakers has been described as being essentially meaningless, cosmetic. Since 1954, Thailand has been a multilateral treaty ally of the United States, and since 1962 has been a bilateral security ally with the United States, such that non-NATO status conferred upon Thailand in 2003 didn't have an appreciable effect in terms of Thailand's procurement opportunities, for example, militarily. It was a feather in Thaksin's cap. It was, again, a quick win for the Americans. It cost them nothing, but it didn't yield appreciable results on either side. Perhaps most egregiously, and I will couch my remarks very carefully, Thaksin agreed to participate, or rather Thailand agreed to participate in activity grossly unlawful under international law, perpetrated on Thai soil, with the full knowledge and complicity of both governments. I'm referring, of course, to the CIA's enhanced interrogation program in the wake of 9/11. More about that in the book. But the argument here goes essentially that the U.S. was willing to sacrifice its long-term interests, comprehensive long-term interest, including its economy and its economic interest in Southeast Asia, on the altar of short-term and counterproductive gains vis-a-vis the war on terror. One other knock-on effect, I should say, of the war on terror before I move on to the coup and conclude my remarks, is that in its desire to and its need to staff hugely increasing embassies in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the policies the State Department was forced to implement was one whereby they said, if you are willing to work for a year in either Iraq or Afghanistan, we guarantee you one of your top 3 choices coming out of Iraq or Afghanistan in terms of where you can serve in the foreign service. Thailand being Thailand, the number of foreign service officers who listed Bangkok among their top 3 choices was astronomical. The result being that even to this day, the State Department has had to limit foreign service officers to 2 years in Thailand, as opposed to the usual 3, 4, potentially 5 years, depending. To the result that the kind of understanding, the kind of contextual understanding that Thais have been looking for from the Americans has in some ways been lacking from the embassy, not on account of embassy personnel themselves. I'm certainly not hanging them out to dry. I can say categorically that in my time at Amnesty and thereafter, the embassy personnel with whom I worked were committed, were professional, were very much on side, and were very much engaged. But the fact is, the policy under which they were operating hamstrung their ability to invest in the country, invest their time, invest their language study, invest their understanding of the country, because they knew within 2 years they'd have to leave so that another spot could be filled with someone leaving Iraq or Afghanistan. It's difficult to characterize in brief terms the coup of 2006. I argue in the book that essentially our response, the American response to the coup, initially was spot on. It was extremely strong. The embassy here was advocating not only full implementation of the of what the Foreign Assistance Act required them to cut by way of assistance and aid, but was advocating for any discretionary funding within the Foreign Assistance Act to be cut. It was actually going so far as to say that we should consider cutting aid and assistance well beyond what we are legally obligated to do. Even Cobra Gold was mooted as something that might be subject to negotiation or leverage. The American response weakened as time went on, as the Thai response became slightly more accommodating. And by that I mean this. Ambassador Boyce told an anecdote whereby he was the first foreign ambassador, to meet General Seriud, who was appointed interim prime minister in the wake of the coup. And he explains that he went in sort of guns blazing, right? Sort of ready to say, look, I've known you for a long time, but the fact is you've got to return the country to democracy within a year, as defined by elections. And he said he was almost preempted by Sarayud, who was so readily willing to commit to this 1 year time frame, although in truth it ended up being about 16 months, that it wasn't necessary for Ambassador Boyce to sort of put his foot down. They both agreed readily to a 1 year time frame. They left the meeting. The press met them. And that is sort of in some ways indicative of the accommodation on a part of the Thais that led to and was partly the result of a weakening of the hard American line that was taken. And I think we all can agree, regardless of what our positions are vis-a-vis the 2014 coup, that the 2014 coup and its response by the Americans were both essentially make-up calls. The Thais firmly believe that if they had just done it right the first time in 2006, they wouldn't have had to stage a coup in 2014. If Sarayud hadn't been so accommodating, perhaps, and the country hadn't returned to democracy as quickly as it did with Thaksin's party coming into power, the 2014 coup may have been preempted. And likewise, the American response. It's a much firmer response for a longer period of time in 2014. Perhaps, I argue, as sort of a make-up call to a weakened, watered-down response in 2006. In my book, I call it the last American coup, not because we staged it, we did not, not because we welcomed it, we did not in particular, but because just looking at Sondhi and Sarayud, who respectively staged the coup and became the subsequent prime minister after the coup, if you look at their pedigree, they were generals whose formative years were very much under American tutelage. They had fought in Vietnam. They had been trained at Leavenworth, Fort Benning, other American institutions. I spoke to one former U.S. Army intelligence officer who had spent time with Sarayud in the 31st Regiment in Lopburi in the late 80s in the Special Warfare Command. These were generals, and this is somewhat indicated by the response of Sarayud to Ambassador Boyce in that meeting, generals who understood the American military, whose own military had been recrafted in the American image, to the West Point image. For better or for worse, their formative years, indeed in the case of these two gentlemen, took place in actual combat in Vietnam and in Indochina. Extending that beyond just these two generals, what I mean to say about the American coup is that it's rather indicative of an entire generational demographic shift in Thailand that I think by 2006 was at its end. A whole slew of leaders across the board, militarily, diplomatically, politically, economically, who, for better or for worse, had their professional formative years not just in America, but by America. Okay, if it was just in America, we could include Thaksin in that, right? He studied in Texas. But I'm not talking about people who have simply been exposed to the American educational system, but rather people whose professional lives were in many ways shaped by the United States in its official capacity. And that generational shift is well underway, and I believe basically the end of that shift was taking place around the time of the American coup. I mentioned WikiLeaks, and I need just to say, my difficult winter notwithstanding, that whatever one thinks of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and the sort of privacy versus transparency debate, across the board, the Americans I've spoken to, the Thais across the political spectrum, have been categorical in stating that it was deeply unhelpful to American-Thai relations. One very long-time American ally, whose name I won't mention, in fact he spoke to me on condition of anonymity, said to me, look, going back to the 50s, and continuing to this day, I meet formally with the CIA station chief. He said after WikiLeaks, any informal meetings that used to also go back to the mid-50s abruptly stopped. He said, I won't go anywhere near the CIA station chief until and unless it's a formal meeting and it's all done by the books. But he said, and I speak for a large swath of old American allies who do not want their names coming up in print, as WikiLeaks, again, even to this day, continues to release troves of cables. What's interesting about the 2006 coup is that it's the opposite in other ways from the 2014 coup, in that in 2006 the Chinese were actually taken by surprise. They did not see the coup coming, and in fact the Chinese ambassador to Thailand paid a professional price for not being able to sort of predict the coup. Whereas it did not surprise the Americans. The WikiLeaks cables make very clear that that the embassy, if they didn't see the coup coming, certainly was ready for it. They had warned the generals against it. Whereas 2014, I think we're seeing some of the opposite. Chinese intelligence, from what I understand, was quite on top of things, while I think the Americans were very much taken by surprise in 2014. I'm going to wrap up my remarks, but I'll say a few final things on the years after the 2006 coup. To characterize Ambassador Boyce's successors as being not entirely up to the task would be perhaps to put it diplomatically, but I think it's all too easy to criticize Ambassadors Eric John and Christy Kenny, because in many ways, Ambassador Boyce was part of the problem. But by that I mean that he had spent 11 of his 20 years in Thailand. 11 of his 20 years in the Foreign Service in Thailand. He was fluent in Thai by the end of the 1990s. He had been political counselor, he had been the DCM, the deputy ambassador, and then he had spent 4 years, I believe, as ambassador. Truly exceptional, and yet I don't think he should have been so exceptional. And I think, in the words of one senior State Department official, the problem with Skip, he said, was there was nothing behind the curtain. The Washington's view of Skip was, no one knows Thailand better than Skip, so send him to Thailand and we're all done with it. He's got it. He's got this. We don't need to give him a whole lot of support. We don't need to give him a whole lot of backing because no one knows Thailand or the Thais like he does. And yet, that's a very dangerous situation to put yourself in because, of course, eventually Skip retires and moves on. And you have this policy vacuum whereby his successors, Ambassadors John and Kenny, whatever you may think about their ambassadorships from a content standpoint, were operating on very few policy tools. Not the least of which was an Assistant Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, who could not have cared any less about Thailand. Could not have cared any less. And so you have a situation in which we can quibble, and I will be writing my chapter on those ambassadors shortly, about their performance. But again, I can't emphasize enough. And the irony here is that their ambassadorships coincide with Obama's essentially stillborn pivot to the region. Right, his pivot to Asia, which has very little to show for it other than about 1,500 Marines in Western Australia. And so you have a situation in which these ambassadors were essentially left to making ad hoc decisions with very little support or guidance from Washington at a time when Thailand was deeply embroiled in a political crisis. A word on Ambassador Kenny. My verdict on her is essentially that she was the right person at the wrong time for two reasons. One, she saw her remit rightly as being the ambassador to all Thais, and not simply to a half-mile radius of wireless road, which historically, given how centralized Thailand is, was likely to hit primarily, the Thaksin notwithstanding, primarily the Democrat Party and the Bangkok elite. She rightly believed that her mandate was to get out of Bangkok and to extend tentacles and missions elsewhere in Thailand. One. Two, her ambassadorship coincided with an explosion of social media in Thailand. It probably existed to some extent under Skip Boyce. I think we had smartphones then, but certainly Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these programs were not being used and utilized to the extent they were under Christy Kenny's ambassadorship. And when you combine the fact that she was predisposed personally to getting out into the provinces, and that she was predisposed personally to using social media. Two things I should point out are now considered best practice within the State Department, largely on account of her time in the Philippines, less on account of her time in Thailand. But she is one of only 5 career ambassadors in the U.S. State Department. It was described to me as essentially being a 4-star general within the State Department. It's a personal rank. You are nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. Depending on how the 2016 election goes, she very well is expected to continue to rise fast through the State Department, depending again who becomes the next president. So she was certainly an operative, but when you factor in the timing of her proclivity to get into the provinces, right when the provinces were becoming extremely relevant in Thai politics, right? Isan, the north were Thaksin strongholds, even the mid-south, which has always been, or since the time of Prem at least, been the Democrat stronghold, sending missions there as well. It was a difficult time to be taking that approach. And likewise, her social media approach came at a time when Thais became absolutely addicted to social media on Twitter and Facebook and so on. The last thing I'll say about any ambassador is that we don't have one at the moment. We have not had an ambassador in Thailand for 10 months. I came here and conducted most of the 74 interviews for the book in January of this year and was unable to meet with the American ambassador because, again, there wasn't one. And I think anyone who says, well, there are up to 30 ambassadors who have been held up by the Senate, across the board, only sort of substantiates the notion that we're not paying enough attention to Thailand, when I would think that senators and congressional reps, some of whom have been in power or in office for as long as this relationship has been strong, would appreciate the geopolitical importance of Thailand in fast-tracking an ambassador to the country. And so to just blame it on the Republican Congress, for example, or blame it on a lack of bipartisanship, I think quite makes the point as opposed to misses the point. I'm going to sort of fade to black on this, I think. The journalists among us will appreciate my desire not to entirely scoop myself in terms of my book, but I'll finish with one quick remark on the monarchy. And of course, there's no better way to silence an already silent room by saying that. Most of the interlocutors, including on the Thai side, have been more than amenable to discussing the monarchy, at least in the context that I'm writing it, namely the bilateral relationships between Thailand and the United States. And I've called the king in my book the single most steadfast American ally in Southeast Asia. Not the least because of his longevity, right? Having come to the throne in 1946, right about the time the Americans were coming into Thailand in the wake of World War II, and of course through the present day. If my thesis holds that the American era is essentially coming to an end, then there is at least a correlation between the longevity of the king's reign and the American era in Thailand. And I took this conclusion to a senior general who has had a long history of liaising with the American military and others, and said, oh yeah, I completely agree with you. I often meet with American interlocutors and describe Thailand's king as being not only Thailand's king, but at various times in history, almost an honorary American king, referring to, for example, the visits that the king and the queen took to the US in the mid-60s, a ticker tape parade in New York, etc. And so I was, of course, duly writing this down, feeling very clever about myself. And the very next day, interviewed Kun Anand Panyarachun, who, in addition to having been Thailand's prime minister twice, is a privy councillor, right? No. And so I say to him, I have it on pretty good authority that I can refer to His Majesty the King as a sort of an honorary American king, and he's the most steadfast American ally in Southeast Asia. And he said to me, I have no problem as such with your characterization, but he said, you Americans, you're always barking up the wrong tree. And I said I'd just let him have the last word on that, and I'll do that tonight as well. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Very good.
Okay, so we'll move to the question period now. If anybody has anything, the microphone's there. I guess I'll start out with the first one, partly in response to some of the comments Benjamin's made with regard to Chinese-Thai relations. If you look at the apparently closer relations between the PRC and Thailand, they seem to stand in contrast to other countries in the region. For example, PRC relations with Myanmar and Vietnam and the Philippines and Japan are actually getting worse. So what is it about Thailand that makes it different compared to those other countries? Benjamin.
That requires, in some ways, going back a few decades, which I won't do, but it's just to say in general terms, Thailand and China, if you read Sarasin Virapon's book, for example, Tribute and Profit, it really talks about, I talk about the American era in Thailand, but the American era is really an interregnum. It's really an intermission. Thailand has always been very close to the Chinese. That changed, of course, after 1949 when the communists took over China. And if what I posit is true and that's coming to an end, it really is just the end of a sort of intermission. So part of it goes back centuries, frankly, in terms of relationships. But to bring it more to more of a contemporary level, Thailand and China have been close basically since, although qualifiedly so, always at arm's length. But there was a lot of trust built in the late 1970s after Vietnam invaded Cambodia. China invaded Vietnam, quote unquote, to teach the Vietnamese a lesson. This was by the time that the Vietnamese and the Chinese had split in terms of their brands of communism. But the Thais were extremely grateful to the Chinese for stepping in helping protect Thailand's eastern border, China filtered weapons to the Khmer Rouge that the Americans were also supporting against the Vietnamese invaders through Thailand. That was the time when General Chavalit, who eventually became Thaksin's defense minister, began procuring weapons from China. They've been described to me as tin cans on wheels, so I'm not sure how good these weapons are, but that was about the time that Chavalit really began to do that. And Thailand, or rather China, has really tried to make, during the late 80s and the 90s in particular, and continuing into the 21st century, to make inroads into ASEAN, and has always seen Thailand as the most advantageous road through which to make that avenue into ASEAN. It also needs to be said, and I cover this at great length in the book, but it's not really within the scope of tonight's discussion, is that the integration of the Chinese in Thailand, the Sino-Thai, the Thai-Chinese, while not perfect, and certainly not perfect during the 50s, 60s, even 70s, began to improve in the 1980s, and to the point of, by the time that the 1990s came around, and certainly the 21st century, the integration of the Thai-Chinese has been virtually seamless. Aside from a few political rallies that, in recent years in which off-the-cuff remarks were made about the Chinese that never really got any traction, for the most part, the integration of the Chinese here has been really quite positive, and I think that has sort of massaged relations between the two countries and made them that much easier. I do not subscribe to the conspiracy theory made famous by certain authors that somehow the Chinese are taking over Southeast Asia through this sort of bottom-up conspiratorial backroom dealing in the least. But I think it simply stands to reason that the seamlessness through which the Thai Chinese and the Chinese themselves are able to do business and to meet with each other has helped facilitate those close relations in recent years.
Sorry, Kun Kasit, you.
Just a bit on the activities with the Chinese. I don't think it is designed or planned to shift from very close relationship with the United States toward the Chinese. It's particularly for this government is more of a reactive to being reprimanded and the soft sanction, quote unquote. And then the Chinese suddenly came in with many offers. The greatness of a one-party type of authoritarian system is good for the country. It's selling that one around the world. Second one is the nitty-gritties of the economic offers, AIIB, purchasing of the rising exchange of submarines and so on. And underneath that is the personalized business interests of people in the establishment from the Thai side, that they get good deals from the Chinese state enterprises and so on. And so that's what it's all about. And I think it's a short-term thing. I don't think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the National Security Office in Thailand have been talking about the shifting of the policy direction. It's a case by case. It's just happening. And I think the Thai side or the Foreign Office or the National Security Office is waiting for some sort of a more constructive gesture from the State Department and from the U.S. Embassy. That has not been forthcoming. At the 1997, there was no help and punishment by the Washington Consensus. And now they had to take over. So I think they need, the military needs some sort of understanding, but not that type of blaming and finger pointing and so on. I think if the relationship is that long, then I think one has to be a bit sensitive to the sensitivity of the Thai establishment. I think that's very important. And I think the field is still open for the U.S. State Department, the embassy here, to regroup itself and pay attention. But I do agree that Kurt Campbell was a problem. I never have any agreement with him on all issues. That's the whole point, It's different from the General Foreign Minister, your State Department, before Hillary, right. Powell and Hillary. I did have very constructive discussions all along in a very cooperative, understanding manner. but Kirk Campbell was a pain. Thank you.
Yes, Jonathan.
Thank you, George. Jonathan Head from the BBC. I think my question is probably posed mostly to Kun Kasit, who's been in the news a little bit in the last 24 hours. Kun Kasit, I mean, you talked about finger pointing. My impression is that the American response to this coup has been pretty routine, actually. What you'd expect after a coup. Both you and David Lyman have kind of asked for understanding for what you call the latest stage in Thailand's long search for some kind of plausible democracy. My impression from talking to a lot of diplomats and other people is they feel this coup is very different, that it is a dead end, that the military can't solve a very different situation in Thailand, a very polarized country, that the military was indeed part of that polarization, that it took sides before, which is partly why they are so unsympathetic to this coup. Now, one of the figures they think is most detrimental in the polarization of Thailand in recent years is Suthep Thaugsupan. And yet you, Kun Kasit, have just decided to join sides with him in helping explain Thailand's current government and defend it to the international community, including the Americans. I would just like to ask you how you expect to achieve a better understanding of the current government in Thailand by partnering up with a man that many people see as a big part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I can accept the fact that it's a routine reaction by the US administration. But I think the point from the military point of view is that they are not here to take over the power in perpetuality. They are here to undertake the reform, and then they need help. Whether that type of help would be forthcoming, that I was saying a few minutes ago, I think that's very important. Not this sanction approach and so on. The second point is that I'm not defending the military regime, and I will not at all. What I would be tasked to do is to explain to the international community the successes and the failures of Thailand and so on. I am representing and trying to speak about Thailand to the international community, and that not necessarily justifying or criticizing the military government.
And sorry, Kun Kasit, did you have any response to Jonathan's points regarding Suthep?
I think today we are talking about Thai-US relations. I will not speak about Suthep. That's another lecture. Thank you.
Suthep will be one of the people the US might have the biggest problem with, and partnering with him, how much credibility are you going to have in dealing with them?
Well, I think action would be an explanation. I think there is certain negative perception about Suthep, but I don't have that very much of that negative perception. I think he's genuine in trying to do something about the country.
Dominic.
Yeah, just one point of information. Anand Paniyarachun is not a Privy Councillor. It's quite an interesting distinction. But anyway, Kun Kasit, I was wondering whether you could tell us from a Thai perspective how much damage you think the WikiLeaks issue did to relations with the US.
What? I did not get the first part.
The first part was a point of information. From a Thai perspective, how much damage do you think the WikiLeaks issue did to relations with the US? What's the Thai take on it?
I think it depends on the government to explain to the Thai people first. How do they react to the US position? And second, they have to be able to explain every day to the Thai people and to the international community why did they take over the power. I think the words peace, stability, and reconciliation is not enough. I think they have to go to the nitty-gritties of things. Why did they take over the power? And this one doesn't have to be made public. But I think, as I have mentioned earlier, they should send a special delegation to Washington. And on the way back, stop in Honolulu at the 7th Fleet Command. And really explain from their hearts out why they have to take over for a short term in order to undertake the reform process. I don't think the Thai diplomatic corps around the world has been doing their utmost together with the military attaches around the world in really explaining what did happen, what transpired, what were the causes of the coup d'etat, or before that, the turmoils on the streets. What are the really major issues that finally the military would have to take over again, and how they could to move Thailand forward?
Michael Mackey, freelance. Just a theoretical question. Wouldn't Thailand actually be better disregarding the example of the Americans and following a more European example? A very good example is Britain. There's no written constitution to complicate things, so governments and politicians have flexibility. And that you yourself, Kun Kasit, talked several times about peace evolution, political evolution. A written constitution is one of the big obstacles to political evolution. Britain is a very good example of political evolution over time. Wouldn't you be better just disregarding the American example and following a British example?
I think as he was mentioning about taking the French school of thought, the Rousseau formula of the general will and the constitution and so on, by the coup maker of the June 1932. Second, we have come this far already, 80 years, that we need somehow like a security blanket, that we must have to have a constitution. But the point about Thailand is that maybe unlike the German experiences after the Second World War, there has not been a real attempt at civic and political education, a continuous process. Neither there is the tradition in the kindergarten and high schools of the United States that they all have to learn about American history and the US Constitution. I think we have come that far to be able to go back to the British way. And let's have the constitution, but at the same time, the human resources development, the capacity building. And I think the Election Commission of the United States could help. And all the think tanks and academic institutions of the United States can render assistance on how to build the capacity in Thailand for all people and institutions. Thank you.
Okay, is that it for the questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, and we definitely appreciate this very fascinating panel tonight. And let's give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you.